Peter Lougheed's name, I think, is synonymous with Calgary and with the entire province as well. A lot is known about the former Premier of Alberta. He, of course, played junior and pro football in Calgary and in Edmonton. He created the Alberta Heritage Fund, and he fought with Pierre Elliott Trudeau over oil and gas revenue. But what you might not know about Peter Lougheed is that he has a Métis grandma. It's the topic of a new book called The Premier and His Grandmother. It's written by author Doris Jean McKinnon, and she joins us now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Thank you for joining us. So what inspired you to write this book about Peter Lougheed and his grandmother?
Well, it stemmed from my second book where I was exploring Isabella Clark Hardesty Lougheed, Peter's grandmother, and the life of another Métis woman, Mary Rose Delorme Smith, and I was just wanting to compare their transition strategies after the fur trade. They had both been born in 1860 and then transitioned and settled in southern Alberta. So I wanted to learn a bit more about how they transitioned. And so as I would be talking about that second book, I would often ask people, if they were aware that Peter Lougheed had an Indigenous grandmother, and the majority of people would say no. And I don't know that I really knew before I delved into this research a lot, and so I just felt that would be something that I wanted to know more about, and I was pretty sure most readers would want to know more about that as well. So that led me to the archives. I visited 3 archives in Alberta just to go through Peter's papers, and so that's what led to this.
Right. So you certainly, it sounds like you learned a lot about Isabella Clark Hardesty Lougheed, having written, essentially 2 books about her. Tell us a bit more about what she was like and what it is about her that really interests you.
So my graduate studies were on Indigenous women, and so Isabella's story was fascinating to me for many reasons. I mean, she was, of course, a daughter of the fur trade, born in the Mackenzie district. Her father was a chief factor with Hudson's Bay Company. And after her father retired, he moved his family to Lachine, Quebec, which is where a lot of HBC men retired. And then not long after that, her father passed away, and her mother sent Isabella to live in Calgary with her uncle Richard Hardesty, who was also a chief factor with Hudson's Bay Company. And so it was shortly after that James Lougheed came west, and James Lougheed, although he had gotten a law degree, he was not from a wealthy family, and he came west with very few connections and not much wealth. And so he had come to Winnipeg first, and then Medicine Hat, and then ended up in Calgary. And that is where he connected with the Hardesty family and had some business endeavors with Richard Hardesty, but also met Isabella, and they married. And not long after that, when Richard actually passed away in an accident, and so James, because of the family connections and so on and the business connections, was able to step into that Senate role. So that really catapulted the couple. He went to Ottawa a lot, and then they eventually built their grand home in Calgary, which is today Lougheed House, a national and provincial historic site. And so, he was knighted as well, Sir James and Lady Isabella. And so they were really the first couple of Calgary. And at that time, there were no hotels and so on. So the dignitaries, the royalty, when they came through, they would be, housed in these grand homes. And so she was really a great, from what I could tell of her, because we don't have a lot of her words that have survived. I only was able to find one letter that was handwritten by her, but there was a lot written about her in newspapers because of her husband's role, and of course, they entertained a lot at Lougheed House, and she was involved in a lot of the organizations. Of course, at that time, there were no hospitals and that kind of thing. And so she was involved in the Victorian Order of Nurses and a lot of these organizations. She would, have the inaugural meetings at what was Bolio House then. And so, my sense is she was really an outgoing person, hosted a lot of events at the home, garden parties and that kind of thing. And in fact, James and Isabella, built the Grand Theatre in Calgary where, they had, performers such as Fred Astaire come through and so on. So they were really the leading couple. And really to demonstrate that even further is when, James passed away in 1925, and most of their, of course, the height of the Depression, and most of their estate was held in real estate. And so, of course, everything, took a dive. And so they lost, eventually she lost, after he passed away, she lost possession of Beaulieu House, but the city allowed her to live there until her death. And that kind of speaks, I think, to how highly regarded she was in the community. So very, very outgoing person, and very, one of the community leaders.
Yeah. So certainly much of her public life and her accomplishments were well documented. But as you said, there wasn't much in the way of her own writing or her own thoughts documented in the archives. To what degree do we know, whether or not she publicly embraced her Métis identity?
Well, so we don't know that because we don't have her words, and also there was an article in the local newspaper, in where she talked about having been lived in the northern fur trade district and sometimes having not a lot to eat and that kind of thing. And so she certainly wanted, she was letting people know that she was from that culture, but not a lot of her words, no, but certainly no denials either. And I mean, I think it's the same as with Peter Lougheed when he was premier. Identity politics were not then what they are today, so people didn't lead with what their identity was, and so there were no denials. But there was an article in the newspaper as well, written by a contemporary who he referred to Isabella as, a half-breed. That was the language they used. And so it certainly was well known, but it was not something that she either, denied or spoke very publicly about, as far as I'm aware. But it was just, Peter didn't talk about it either, but it was, he was very busy, leading the province. And so it wasn't something that people led with, but certainly people knew that he was as well, that he had that ancestry,
Mm-hmm. And I know you spoke to Peter Lougheed's son, Joe, as part of your research. What did he say about the family's cultural lineage?
So Joe, from Joe's perspective, Peter was very proud of the fact that he had an Indigenous ancestor, and it's something that he, never hid, and that he, in fact, embraced, because there's a picture of Isabella's mother, who was an Indigenous woman from the Columbia district, and that picture, according to Joe, was always featured prominently in the house, in Peter's home, and he also had a copy of it in his personal papers that I found at the archives. And according to Joe, Peter had many books, history books on Indigenous peoples and so on. And so my sense is that it was something that Peter was proud of, certainly did not deny, wanted to know more about. In fact, when, the people from Lougheed House, the archivists and so on, when I started to research this, what I was told was that Peter, as he left public office, that he devoted himself more to, restoring the house and ensuring it gained that national historic status, and that he was more, interested, I guess, in preserving the history. And I think that's kind of often, like many people, is as we age, we start to reflect more on our ancestry and our history and that kind of thing. And so I think there was certainly, some, there was pride. That's my sense, is what I read, from what I gathered in the archives and from what I gathered from Joe.
Yeah, I think you're right in that many people will be surprised to hear about the Métis ancestry in the Lougheed family. Before we go, Doris Jean, what insights do you hope people take away from reading your book?
Well, I think there's a few there. I think that I would like people to know about this part of Peter's history for sure, because it's something that, as you said, we don't know a lot about. And any books that I've come across that have been written about Peter, if they mention it, it's very briefly, and sometimes they get it wrong, or a lot of times they don't even mention it. So I think that it's just a little bit more that we didn't know about Peter Lougheed, and so many people are interested in his life and so on. And also the idea, the reality that the Métis women, Indigenous women in general, made contributions to a lot of our pioneer communities. They were involved in a lot of these community building initiatives, and we don't often know that either. And so I think that's something that I think is very important, that I hope people gain from reading my book.
Well, Doris Jean, really great to speak with you about this today. Congrats on the book, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time, Chris. I enjoyed it.
Me as well. Doris Jean McKinnon, the author of the book The Premier and His Grandmother, Peter Lougheed, Lady Bell, and the Legacy of Métis Identity.